Hello to each and every one who are joining us today. I'm Craig Von Buzik, and you are joining the Stories and Myths program. And today is a very special edition of the Stories and Myths program where we are celebrating the release of my new book called Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, which has been released just 2 days ago by LPC Books, which is part of Iron Stream Media. So I'm very excited about that. And we are thrilled to be sharing with you the excitement. Sorry that we're running a little bit late. We actually started right at 5:30, and unfortunately, Facebook was down and it was not working. But we seem to be live now. And if anybody's out there, I see one viewer. If you could just let us know that you're seeing it all right and hearing everything all right, that would be wonderful. But I want to welcome tonight my special guest. And let me just read a little bit about the bio for Aaron Zuck Jr. He's a multi-award winning author and speaker. He's thrilled thousands with his YA Christian mystery adventure series about two inquisitive brothers and their dogs who solve one crisis after another around the world. Aaron is a retired U.S. Army colonel and lives with his wife, Joyce, in Texas. And you can learn more about him at zookbooks.org. Aaron, welcome to Stories and Myths. So glad you're with us tonight.
Thanks, Craig. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure. And you have read the Victor book already, and you gave it a very kind and generous endorsement. Let's paint a little picture about your background. A colonel in the Army is not a slouch. You worked your way up the ladder to a very impressive position. So tell us, how long were you in the Army, and a little bit about some of your duty stations. I know you taught at a couple of places as well. Was that in the Army or after the Army? Please give us an update on your background.
Okay, so I actually have served in two different services branches. One was the Air Force. I served in that from 1974 to 1978. And then I spent over 26 years in the Army, and that's how I ended up to be a colonel.
Wow.
So it was a lot of fun in both services. In the Air Force, I spent a lot of time at temporary duty stations around the country, and then I ended up in Okinawa, Japan for 2.5 years. Which is a beautiful island, and I have a book that actually has part of that in the book, and book number 4 of my series.
What's the name of that book?
The name of that book is called
Oh, I stumped you. I'm sorry.
Isle of Intrigue.
Okay.
No, it just took me a second to remember.
I know.
Anyway, so I spent some time in Okinawa, 2.5 years, and then I got out of the Air Force, and I went back to college at Penn State University. Graduated as a music education major.
I'm from Pennsylvania as well. Good university.
Yes, it is outstanding. And then I went into the Army, and since I was out for more than 5 years, I had to start all over again with basic training.
Oh, wow.
So I've been through basic training twice. Then I went to Officers Candidate School, which is like basic training on steroids. So, anyway, after I finished that, I started my different assignments. I ended up in Germany for over 9 years in my 26 plus years in the Army, and spent time in Baumholder, Germany when I was a battalion commander. I spent time in Heidelberg, which is the capital. It was the capital of West Germany at that time. Spent some time in Gurpingen, Germany. And then I had a NATO assignment for 3 years, which was in Rheindahlen, Germany. So a lot of great time in Europe. Really enjoyed that. Had various assignments. And as you said, teaching wise, I ended up at the Adjutant General School. Adjutant General officers are basically personnel and administration officers. And Horatio Gates was one of those. And I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I ended up teaching the advanced course, and we taught a lot about the different Civil War battles that happened, and Ulysses Grant came up several times. So really cool. And then I went to a school that was Command and General Staff College, and that was at Leavenworth in Kansas, and not in the prison, but out of the prison, right? And we studied Ulysses Grant there as well. So I've actually run into that several times, and your book was amazing.
Well, thank you for that. And I'd like to hear, with your background as a colonel in the Army, with all the years of your service and your teaching, tell me a few things that really stood out to you. And I'm not looking for you to pat my back. I just want people to know what about this story stood out. And you had said something to me at one point that that you think that this book should be required reading in these Army colleges because it gives a different perspective than the typical reading that they do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. When we study the battles in the Civil War, in the advanced course, and the officers' advanced course for the adjutant general officers, we basically studied the battles. And the battles gave you just the character of the person who was in the lead, or the various generals that were in the book at that point in time, and how they thought about the actual battles. But it didn't give you really a lot about their personal history at all. And so when your book was written, I actually got a real good glimpse into the character of Ulysses S. Grant. It showed not only his character when it came to a personal test, which was cancer, where he eventually contracted cancer. He had to battle through that, but he also had to battle through some betrayals by people when he got out of when he finished his second term as a president. And I was just amazed that he had the way that he handled that. He just handled it with such integrity and such honor, and he was humility. His humility was very great, and it just showed that this man is just a tremendous leader inside and out, not only with the troops, but also in the civilian world and with all his personal dealings as well.
Wow. Obviously, you're no longer officially with the military, but if you were to have read this years ago, how do you think that it might have spoken into the different areas of leadership that you were a part of?
Well, I think it's really good because we teach leadership in our schools. So I was teaching the captains at the advanced course what leadership was all about. And he has some great leadership principles. And your second book is going to cover a lot of those things. But the bottom line is when you get into this Victor biography, it actually leads you down the path to show you what creates a great leader. And it's those foundational characteristics that a person's character is made of, and it's how they act, not just how they think. And Grant was able to do that, not only in his personal life, but also when he was on the battlefield. So being able to, he was just a complete person, and we call it an integrated person, or somebody with integrity, somebody that actually shows his character in his personal life, and it also is portrayed in his military life as well, in his decisions, because he's putting a lot of lives of troops on the line every time he makes a decision.
Yeah, yeah. Now you are an author as well, and when did that part of your career start? Were you still in the military when you started writing your books?
Actually, my book writing didn't come until I got out of the military. However, when I was in high school, I did write some science fiction short stories, which I wanted to get published, but I was too timid to actually put them in a magazine. I was afraid to send them in, even though I didn't know that at that point in time, there are people looking for young authors. They really want to get a hold of them so they can help them with their careers.
Right.
So I put that away. But in the military, I did some writing too. As a matter of fact, as an instructor at the advanced course, I taught writing as one of the subjects. And we taught military writing, which is short and to the point, very concise. But I also wrote a military regulation, which is for the Army. I wrote the military regulation for the Adjutant General Corps and how they should actually function in battle. It was called FM 12-6, and that's actually the designation for it. I wrote the draft of that, and then the captain who came in behind me actually finished it up. So I wrote then, and then when I got out of the military, I told my boys some stories in Germany. We were riding in a van, and I was keeping them entertained because we were taking them from one swim meet to another. And on these trips, we'd settle them down. My wife would give them some gorp, which is trail mix. And then I would tell them a story for half an hour to an hour. And those stories eventually made it into the books that I have today. And I've got 5 published novels so far in the series. I've got one that I'm just about finished, book number 6, and book 7 should be around the corner shortly after that.
So are these are like mystery suspense type young adult novels?
Yes, exactly. So I've written them for young adults. I actually have a lot of adults that read them too because they like the exciting mysteries that I lay out, all the intrigue, and I really put them in some dire situations. So because their dad's a military intelligence officer in the Army, I wonder where that came from. And their mom is a homeschooling mom. They travel the world, and their first 2 books are in Germany. The third one's in Austria, and all that's in Europe. And then the 4th one's in Okinawa, Japan. And the 5th one happens to start in the great state of Texas, right?
All right. Sounds like the old adage, write what you know, right?
That's exactly right. And that's what I'm doing, writing what I know. Anyway, so they get involved with a lot of exciting situations. A human trafficking organization grabs them in one book. They're captured by terrorists in another book. They have to deal with a mafia in Okinawa in Japan. And then finally, there's somebody crashing coasters in the United States, and it starts in Texas, and the boys are blamed for it. And they have to get themselves out of that situation, right? So they get the FBI involved, and finally they solve the mystery.
Wow, very cool. Well, that sounds great. How many books did you say are out now?
I have 5 that are published, and I'm working on book 6, and I hope to get it to my publisher in May.
All right. Do you know when that'll be released?
I'm hoping that it'll come out before the Christmas rush, so sometime in late October, early November.
All right. Well, excellent. Congratulations on all of those books. That's very exciting.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over. We're going to switch roles now. And you had some questions for me as a result of reading the Victor book. And you also mentioned you had talked about the second book. And for those of you who haven't heard yet, there is a companion book that's coming out May 25th called Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. And that was actually, it's interesting because, and I'll tell you a little bit about this story before you ask your question.
Okay.
The people at Iron Stream had asked about, maybe adding some leadership items to the biography. And I said, biographies don't typically have that kind of thing in them. And so we kind of put it on the shelf. And I was talking to my daughter, who's very artistic and very intelligent, that night. And she said, well, Dad, why don't you go ahead and write a companion book, a second book, just about the leadership principles? So the next morning I emailed the people at Iron Stream and pitched that. And immediately an email came back from the publisher, and he said, you won't believe this, but we're sitting here talking about the possibility of you writing a second companion book on the leadership principles. So that book is called Forward, and it will come out in May, and we'll have another party when that comes out. But the book we're talking about tonight is Victor, and it is the final 2 years in the life of Ulysses S. Grant. And before you ask your question, just a quick thumbnail.
Okay.
Grant was a 2-term president. As you mentioned earlier, he got out of the White House. He traveled the world for 2 years as America's first diplomatic president. And this was so valuable to the United States that President Rutherford B. Hayes gave Grant free rides on Navy ships to go from country to country during that world tour. And then afterwards, Grant came back to America, and he went into business with his son, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., who was born in Ohio. So they called him Buck, which is short for Buckeye. Yeah. And so Buck Grant got him into this Wall Street investment firm with their partner named Ferdinand Ward. And unfortunately, Ward was a shyster, and he was the Bernie Madoff of the 1880s. And it was a giant Ponzi scheme. And so after a couple of years, the whole thing collapsed, and Grant was left with literally $80. And only a few months after that, he was diagnosed with incurable throat cancer. So he knew he was dying, and he knew he needed to take care of his wife because they didn't have money at that point. And so many people had talked to him about writing his memoirs, and he decided to do that. And in the end, I'm skipping over a whole lot of detail, but he ended up making an agreement with Mark Twain, who was his good friend, who had his own publishing company called Charles Webster and Sons. or Charles Webster and Company. And so Grant finished the memoirs. He wrote in tremendous pain for that last year in his life. He finished them 4 days before he died. And the books were published by Twain later that year. And they ended up making for Julia Grant, his widow, $450,000. It was the second most popular book of the 19th century, second only to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that amount of profit for Julia Grant allowed her to live out the rest of her years in, comfort without fear. And in today's money, it would be worth $10 million. So it was an amazing, heroic effort. And it's a story of love that he gave that last year in excruciating pain when most people who have throat cancer would be lying in bed with morphine. He refused the morphine during the day. He'd take it at night so he could sleep. But during the day, he wanted his mind to be clear. And so for a year, he wrote in pain and gave this gift to his wife, to his family. And so I'll turn it over to you now with the questions that you have in mind.
That's great. Well, I'd like to ask you a question that I really wondered about this from the very beginning when I started reading the book. I'd like to know what really inspired you to write the book, Victor, and basically about his final battle. How did you come up with the inspiration to do that?
I actually thought about being a history major when I was in undergrad.
Okay.
But nobody could convince me that I could make a living doing it. And at the time, there was no internet for me to do search. There were some old books in the library that said, yeah, you might be able to work in a museum or be a park ranger and that kind of thing. And so I really didn't have any guidance, even though it was something that really interested me. I've been interested in history since the 1970s when I first watched the Broadway musical 1776. And that got me interested in the Revolution, which then led to interest in history. So fast forward to about the year 2000, and I had seen parts of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary on TV, but I finally got around to buying the full VHS cassettes, and they were like this wide, all the VHSs. I still have, no, I gave them to my son because later my kids bought me the DVDs. So I gave them to my son. So he has the VHSs now. And in the midst of watching that amazing documentary, Ken Burns and his brother Rick were joined by the writer. And the writer is actually, and I'm trying to remember his first name, but he is a descendant of Ferdinand Ward. And he wrote the script for this. And in the story, they tell about this whole situation with Grant and Buck and Ferdinand Ward and the whole Ponzi scheme collapsing. And I was amazed. I was amazed for a couple of reasons. One, I was amazed that, Grant had to give up his military pension in order to run for president. But then after he left the White House, there was no presidential pension, and they wouldn't give him back his military pension. So this savior of the Union, two-term president, ends up needing to go find a job. Yeah. And sadly, he hooked up with this charlatan, this shyster, who was lying the whole time to the Grant family. All of the Grant family, including aunts and cousins, invested everything, and they lost everything. And so it wasn't just Ulysses that went bankrupt. It was Fred, his oldest son. It was Buck, his middle son. It was Jesse, his youngest son. Several other generals had trusted Grant and had invested. Several of just the regular soldiers had invested their life savings and lost everything. It was one of the biggest calamities on Wall Street in American history. So it was a fascinating thing. Then, only a few months later, he starts writing his these articles for a magazine called the Century Magazine, just to start making a little bit of money. And they did extremely well. Everybody wanted to hear the perspective of Ulysses Grant on these battles. And while he's writing one of these articles, his wife served him lunch, including a peach. and he bit into this peach, and he cried out in pain because he thought there was an insect in the peach that stung him on the inside of his throat. And so this pain never really went away. So finally, after like 3 months, sadly, he waited that long. He finally went to a doctor. The doctor looked down his throat and knew right away, this is bad. And Grant could see on his face, this is bad. And so they froze a little bit of the back of his tongue and took a little snip and sent it. They had microbiology back then. Right. And so they did the tests on it. And the gentleman who did the test was a man named Dr. Schrady. And Dr. George Schrady was a leading microbiologist at the time. He did not know who this person was that he was testing. And so when Grant's doctor, Dr. John Hancock Douglas, went to see what the test was, he met with Dr. Schrady, and Dr. Schrady said, this person has incurable throat cancer. It's starting in the base of the tongue. And so he said, this person, it doesn't look good. And Dr. Douglas said, are you sure? And Dr. Schrady said, perfectly sure. And so Dr. Douglas said, well, this person is Ulysses S. Grant. And Schrady answered, well, then General Grant is doomed. And sure enough, the cancer already was starting to spread. And so this was an amazing story I didn't know about. And I don't think most people know this story. And the fact that he would work for that final year of his life in excruciating pain. The only thing that they would do to calm the pain is they would spray cocaine water into his throat. Okay. And that would dull the pain for a little bit. And, my daughter and I went up to Grant Cottage, which I highly recommend. It's on top of Mount McGregor, just outside of Saratoga, New York, and good people there. In fact, the director of Grant Cottage has written the foreword for Victor, and it's wonderful. He did such a wonderful job. So shout out to our friends at Grant Cottage. But when we went there, they literally have this jar, and it's about this big, and it's full of water, but the bottom of it has this white sediment at the bottom. And that is the cocaine that's settled to the bottom over 150 or 140 years since then, and almost 140 years. And that's the actual water that they used to spray Grant's throat. And it's still there inside this sealed jar. It's amazing. So Grant was so in love with his wife, Julia. They had a lifelong love affair, and he was devoted to his children. And so even though he had not wanted to write his memoirs, he decided to do this to give the last year of his life, not only to help them get on their feet financially and to secure Julia's future after his death, but he also confronted the lies that were being disseminated by what was called the Lost Cause School of Thinking. These were former Confederates who were embarrassed that the Confederate states of America had pulled away from the United States because of the cause of slavery. And so it was so embarrassing to them that they decided to change what they said the war was about. It was no longer about slavery, but these writers and these historians who were pro-Southern, pro-Confederate said that the war was about states' rights, or it was about tariffs. Well, it was only about states' rights because it was connected to slavery. It was only about tariffs because it was connected to the plantations and the plantation class and the slavery market of cotton. And they said cotton was king. Well, why was cotton king? Because of slaves being able to collect all this cotton and give the Southern economy that amazing boost. And so Grant very clearly confronted that and said, no, it's very clear. In fact, the very final part of his personal memoirs, the very last couple pages, he says, this war was about slavery, and which is one of the worst causes that anyone ever fought a war about. And he had said to, and I talk about this in the book, he had met with Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany. And von Bismarck said, it was so sad that you had to have this civil war. And Grant immediately responded. And this was witnessed to by a journalist, Russell Young, who wrote a book called Traveling the World with General Grant. And so Young heard this, wrote it down. He was a scribe, basically following Grant around and writing this book. And so Grant immediately responded to von Bismarck and said it had to be done. And Bismarck said, oh, yeah, you had to save the Union. And he said, not only save the Union, we had to destroy slavery. And Bismarck was shocked by that. And Grant followed up and he said, when slavery fired upon Fort Sumter, we knew that it was a cancer on our country that had to be eradicated and that we could not make a peace with. Those are remarkable words. And those were words after Grant had left the White House. So he was a mature statesman, a politician. He had thought through all these things. And this is where he had concluded that not only was the war about slavery, but that slavery had to be eradicated in order for there to be, as Lincoln said, a new birth of freedom in the United States.
So you wrote about a lot of things really that I did not know about. And I'm sure a lot of the folks that I taught in the military schools didn't know anything about either. If I were to talk to a lot of the military senior leaders, I don't know that many of them would understand what Grant did and why he did those things and how he was really like inside as a person. We studied about that a little bit maybe, but not really in depth. And your book brings that out in great detail. So how long did it take you to write Victor? And what I saw that you had so many citations in there. It looked like you were in the library all the time. So
I felt like I was. Like I said, I started on the quest of understanding Grant in 2000. Mm-hmm. And then in about the year 2012, I was ready to write the book, but someone else wrote the book. And so I thought, well, and this happens to us as writers. I'm sure you've had ideas that all of a sudden someone else publishes and you say, well, I guess I'll have to wait another 10 years. And that was my feeling on this, was that I felt like I wanted to write a book about it, but I can't write a book when there is a book about it. So during that time, I had written my book, I Am Cyrus, the story of Harry S. Truman and the rebirth of Israel. Right. And when I finished that book, the Grant story was still burning inside of me. So I looked at it again and I said, it's going to take me a few years to do the research. And by that time, it'll be about 10 years since the other book came out. And that's enough time, especially with a person as huge as Grant. But I didn't want it to be so close to the writing of the other book. I wanted it to be my own thing. And so I decided to make mine a little bit different. And you and other people have told me that this difference really helps to set this book apart and gives it kind of a specialness. And you can talk about that in a moment. But what I felt like I needed to do was, we talk about Grant going through this sickness. We talk about him writing his memoirs, and that's all very dramatic. But I thought, to take it to even a higher level, why don't I write about the battles that he's writing about in his memoirs? And so I actually flash back to the battles. So I start with Shiloh, right. Then I do Vicksburg, and then I fast forward to the where the greatest general of the South, Robert E. Lee, goes up against the greatest general of the North, Ulysses S. Grant. And so it's really like the Super Bowl of the Civil War between these two generals, which was called the Overland Campaign. And so after the amazing victory at Vicksburg, which, folks like you taught that and still teach it in these Army colleges today because it was such a brilliant strategy and a brilliant victory. Then Grant went on to lead another amazing victory at Chattanooga. And so everybody knew that he was the one that was going to lead the armies for the rest of the war. And Congress passed a law reinstating, this is an amazing thing, reinstating the office or the rank of lieutenant general that had been retired, because the last person to have that rank was George Washington.
Right.
But they were so impressed with Grant, and they also knew how important it was to make a statement that, watch out, Confederacy, our best guy is on his way. And by the way, he's got the same rank as George Washington.
Right.
And so in the spring of 1864, Grant was given this rank by President Lincoln in a White House ceremony. And then he went ahead and led the army against Robert E. Lee. And that was when hell was truly unleashed for both the Union and the Confederacy. Up until that time, they fought some really tough battles. Shiloh was a bloodbath, and Antietam was a bloodbath. Fredericksburg was a bloodbath, but they were individual sessions, and then they would separate for months while both armies retooled and they brought in new soldiers. At least the North brought in new soldiers. The South had all the soldiers that they could find, and so they just let them heal up a little bit. But once Grant got involved, this was part of his strategy, was divide and conquer and fight every single major Confederate army and keep them separated so they can't reinforce each other, and fight them as often as you possibly can, because he knew that it was a bit of a war of attrition. As he said in some letters that he wrote, the Confederates had placed their last man in the trench. Like we used to say, or still people say, we're going to fight to the last man. Well, what does that mean? That means the last man that you could find for your army. Well, that actually literally happened for the Confederacy. And so Grant knew the last man was already in the trench. And some of these men were 14-year-old boys or 60-year-old grandfathers. And I mean, you do have to admire their courage. And, as awful as the cause was, the fact that they were willing to fight for that cause with such dedication, you have to give them points for that. But that was the Overland Campaign, and Grant continued to hit. And then down in the South, Sherman, leading the Western Army, continued to hit. And one by one, all of the Confederate armies started to fall. First, in Mobile Bay, Admiral Farragut closed off Mobile Bay, which was the second to last port to close. The last one was Wilmington in the spring of 1865. But then Atlanta fell under Sherman, which we see in Gone with the Wind. And then Hunter was the general in the Shenandoah Valley, and Grant was a little disappointed with him. And Hunter was not, he was a good man. He was a man of character, and Grant actually liked him a lot personally, but he wasn't getting the job done. And so Grant came in and said, listen, I want Sheridan to come in and take over on the field, and you could be in charge in the office. And Hunter said, you know what? Too many cooks. I'm just going to step aside, which is really a remarkable thing. And Hunter is a hero for having done that. And so Sheridan, who was one of the great commanders, I mean, he had some personal flaws that were really terrible. And some of the things he said later on were atrocious. But as a army commander, he was one of the greatest generals in American history. And he went to war against the Confederates in the Shenandoah and just swept them out. And then he rejoined the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James for the final fight and the final push to overcome the siege of Petersburg and Richmond. And when Petersburg and Richmond fell, then it was a race to Appomattox. And it was Sheridan, along with Custer. We forget about Custer in his last stand, but Custer was really an amazing cavalry officer. And he got around first with his corps to get in front of Lee. And then Sheridan followed up. And then the Army of the James, you got to just love these guys, and the Army of the Potomac, because they marched through the night exhausted, because they knew that they were just about to surround Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And so they were so exhausted, but they finally did. So you had the Appomattox River on the north. You had the cavalry. Sorry, I'm trying to get this right because everything's backwards. You had the cavalry on the west. You had the Army of the James on the south, and you had the Army of the Potomac on the east. And so Robert E. Lee said to General Gordon, try to break out, because they thought that it was just the cavalry. And so they attacked, and all of a sudden they came up to the crest of this hill, and down below, just as the sun is rising, it's an amazing scene. Just as the sun is rising, the whole field is filled with thousands of soldiers from the Army of the James. And Gordon said, that's it. And that was the end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very amazing. I mean, Grant had such a strategic mind. I mean, he wasn't just looking at the short picture, a battle here, a battle there. When I was teaching, when you teach captains, you're teaching them the tactical situation, and they get it to become a major and a lieutenant colonel. They learn the operational situation, which is a much larger area and it contains many battles. But the strategic commander, the one at the top, has to be the one with a mind that encompasses the whole battle of the war in his mind, so that he can actually execute it. I mean, him becoming a lieutenant general, and that reminded people of Washington, also put him in charge by rank of all the major generals that worked for him, thus unifying the army and helping him accomplish the task, which is incredible. And then in your book, when you talk about the different, you said 19 battles, I think is what you put in your book, and you accomplished this by intertwining what was going on with Grant while he was writing the book, and that really captured my mind. It was the emotional battle he was fighting in cancer. It was the battles he was fighting on the ground. And, it eventually came out that Lee had to surrender to him at Appomattox. But the whole point of getting to that whole point was just one strategic move after another, almost like him writing his book in a fashion. So when he got to the end, it was completed and supported his wife. I thought that was incredible. And you drew that out very, very well. So tell me, though, there was somebody really important in his life, Mark Twain. And how did he figure into his life? I never knew that Ulysses Grant knew him.
Well, here's the great irony about Mark Twain. And by the way, everything you said about the strategy is so true. And those who would say that Grant was a butcher and he was just, he just had overwhelming forces and overwhelming resources, and that's the only reason he won the war. That's, the facts don't uphold that at all. Mm-hmm. Grant had the same number of resources that Hooker had, that Pope had, that Burnside had, that McClellan had. All these other generals had the same resources, but they all lost to Robert E. Lee. It was Grant's strategy that made the difference and that turned things around. And one of the things that people need to realize is that Grant is one of the only generals in American history to have received the surrender of three armies. Wow. He won in Fort Donelson, then he won in Vicksburg, and then the ultimate victory, he received the surrender of Robert E. Lee, of all people, at Appomattox. So, yeah, I totally agree with you. Strategy of Grant was absolutely amazing. And the more you learn about it, the more you realize this was a genius. Grant was a genius. And, he was a quiet man. They called him the Sphinx. And so I actually start the book with him on a camel standing in front of the Sphinx in Egypt, to kind of paint the picture that this man, the Sphinx, was seeing the old Sphinx. So he didn't talk a lot, and he didn't talk a lot about himself. And that's why people underestimated him. He let his actions speak for him. But as far as his relationship with Twain, what's really remarkable is that at the very beginning, when Grant was first a colonel in Illinois, and he was given an assignment to go after these guerrilla Confederate raiders in Missouri. Mm-hmm. And so he speaks about this in his memoirs, and he says that he was going up this hill, and the higher he got on the hill, the more his heart went up into his throat, and he was getting more and more afraid and filled with anxiety. And he said, when I was in the Army and I was following the officers, I didn't have this feeling. But now I'm in charge and they're following me. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we're about to go into battle. And he gets to the crest of that hill, and the Confederate guerrillas had heard that they were coming, and they skedaddled. And Grant realized something. He said, I realized at that moment that the Confederates were just as afraid of me as I was of them. And I never forgot that lesson for the rest of the war. And it helped him to have courage in the rest of the war. But the ironic thing is, I don't know if he was necessarily a part of that particular guerrilla group, but Mark Twain at that time, Samuel Clemens, was one of the Confederate groups right there within just a couple miles of Grant in Missouri. So there was a possibility that they might have shot at each other during the Civil War. But Samuel Clemens didn't like the discipline of the Army. It was just, it went, if you know anything about Mark Twain, you know that, he's not an Army kind of guy. And so he was in the Army for 3 months, and then he left without leave. And in order to keep from being hung, he went out to California and Nevada, where he really started his writing career. So, it worked out for all of us that he left without leave. So years and years went by, and he actually grew to really respect Ulysses S. Grant just because of all the amazing accomplishments that he did. And so as Mark Twain's star was rising, so was Ulysses S. Grant's star rising.
Right.
And so Mark Twain, started to have real success with Tom Sawyer and with some of his other books. And so when Grant was president, one of their mutual friends decided to introduce Twain to Grant. Well, Grant didn't talk much, and he's in the White House in his office, and they bring Mark Twain in, and the two of them just stand there staring at each other because Twain didn't want to speak first, and Grant never spoke to anybody, very rarely, or he did once he got to know somebody, but at first he would never talk to people. And so finally, Twain said, well, Mr. President, General Grant, I'm not embarrassed. Are you? And they just laughed, and that was the end of the meeting, and Mark Twain left. So 10 years went by or so, a few years, several years went by, and they would see each other here and there at different gatherings and different meetings. And no, it was not 10 years because it was after Grant returned from his world tour. So it might've been 6 years later or 7 years later, but a few years went by, and Grant was being honored at this big veterans rally in Chicago. And by now, Mark Twain's a bigwig. And so they asked Mark Twain to give the big speech to honor General Grant. And so he comes up onto the platform and comes up next to General Grant, and Grant leans over to him and says, I'm not embarrassed. Are you? Which is wonderful. And from that moment on, they became very close friends. So they would smoke cigars together. They would chat and tell stories. And Grant eventually was given a house. The Congress, this is one of the embarrassments of our history. The Congress did not take good care of General Grant. If you compare what the British Parliament did for Wellington, who was the commander at Waterloo, they lavished him with millions of pounds and houses and all these different things. And Grant didn't have an income, didn't have a house. And so the robber barons of the time, people like J.P. Morgan and Carnegie and some of the others of that era, they looked at this, and so did Mark Twain, as a disgrace. And so they raised money on their own, from their own pockets, to buy Grant a house in New York City and to give him they gave him a bunch of money that he could use as a trust fund, which sadly he lost to Ferdinand Ward. And but he did keep the house because of Vanderbilt, who basically had taken over because Grant had taken a loan from him, which we go into the details in the book. But Vanderbilt basically took over the house and said, listen, you could stay there for the rest of your life. And so Julia Grant stayed in that house for the rest of her life after Ulysses had passed away.
Right.
So Twain used to come by there in New York City because Twain's offices were in Manhattan for his own publishing company, Charles Webster and Company. And so he would just stop by at lunchtime, and they'd sit around, smoking a cigar and telling stories. And the funny thing is, you can actually find this online. Twain told the story to Grant about how close they came to, almost shooting each other in Missouri. But he, in his wonderful imagination, he embellished it like crazy. And he created an article for Century Magazine. And it's something like, I can't remember the title, but you can look it up if you said Mark Twain attacks U.S. Grant, Century Magazine. And, Grant laughed hysterically. And this was while Grant was in all this pain and was writing his memoirs. And they take a break, and Twain would tell him these hysterical stories. And actually, Twain said, I thought about putting Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer into the book or into the story, saying that they came out of the woods and they ran into a Union officer, and he said, my name is Colonel Grant. He said, but in the end, I thought, nah, I'm not gonna do that. So anyway, in the end, Mark Twain said of his relationship with Grant, he said he was a very great leader and superlatively good as a human being. And it's a wonderful relationship that we tell in detail in Victor, the final battle of Ulysses S. Grant.
I have a couple other questions, though, about relationships, some of the relationships he had. First off, when you talked about him writing and Mark Twain being involved in his life, wasn't there somebody before that was actually going to help him publish his work, but they weren't going to give him a good deal?
Well, yeah, I had talked about earlier how, when he was without means, they had to lay off all their staff. They had to shutter that home that they were given in New York City, and they went to their cottage that they owned free and clear out on Long Branch, New Jersey. I went to the site of that home, which ridiculously was torn down by very short-sighted people back, I think, in the 1950s. All those photographs are actually available of them tearing down the house and of the house before they tore it down on the Library of Congress website. And it's just such a tragedy that was torn down. But they were at that house trying to figure out how are they going to make ends meet, what were they going to do. And Grant was approached by the Century Magazine, which would have been like Life magazine or the Atlantic magazine, one of these magazines that had short stories and essays and that kind of thing. It was a very popular magazine at the time. And they wanted Grant to write stories from his perspective on the different battles. And so he started with Shiloh. And the first edition of it was not much different than what he had written for his battle report to the War Department. And it was dry and lifeless. And they were like, oh, we're in trouble. This stinks. And so they sent out one of their editors, a young man named Robert Underwood Johnson, who just had a knack for pulling good writing out of people who were not necessarily writers. And so he explained to Grant there in Long Branch on their piazza, they used to call it. We call it a porch or a deck. They called it a piazza, which sounds very impressive. Yeah. But they were out on the piazza, and he said, how did you feel? What was going through your mind? What were some of your thoughts as you were in Shiloh? And, you were surprised, and you were, really fighting to keep from disaster happening. What was going on there? And so Grant started to see, oh, that's what you want. Right. And so he learned, and that was another thing about Grant, is he was a quick study. Once he understood something, he grasped it and his mind held on to it. And so Grant started to write a rewrite, and it ended up being marvelous. And the Century Company published it, and it became a huge seller. I mean, the magazines were flying off the shelves. And so when that happened, Century said, ooh, we've come on to something here. And so they approached Grant and they said, we would like you to write your memoirs. Well, many people had asked Grant to write his memoirs before this, but, he thought he was worth $1 million. I don't need to write my memoirs. The other thing about it is that Grant was a very humble person. He was raised by a good Methodist mother who taught him not to flaunt his own reputation and let his actions speak for him. And so he looked at a lot of these, a lot of those memoirs then and even some now are braggadocious pieces where everybody's puffing themselves up and trying to tear down their opponents. Grant didn't want anything. He found that quite distasteful. And so he didn't want to do his memoirs. But now that he's without money and dying of cancer, he realizes that this is the last thing available to him in order to save his wife from living in poverty. And so he went to work to start writing his memoirs. And the Century Company, they were a magazine company. They were not a book publishing company. So they sent Grant this ridiculous contract. Now, you and I as writers, we've seen some ridiculous contracts that have been sent to us, which really are disrespectful to us as writers with our expertise. And so you kindly say, no, thank you, and you move on. Well, Grant, that was one of the things about Grant was as far as it came to business, Mark Twain said he was like a babe in the woods. He had no business acumen at all. And so he almost signed this very bad contract. Well, what happened is Mark Twain was also writing articles for the Century Company and went to dinner with the publisher. And the publisher forgot that Mark Twain had his own publishing company. And he started bragging about the fact that it looks like Grant was going to write his memoirs for them. Well, Twain had asked Grant to write for him 2 years earlier, write the memoirs for him 2 years earlier. And so Twain was like, he said, my ears pricked up, when he heard this. And the very next morning, he shot over to Grant's house, saying, hey, I'm here to have a cigar with you, and so they sat down and Twain says, hey, there's a rumor out there that you're getting ready to write your memoirs. And Fred Grant, Grant's oldest son, who also became a colonel and then actually a general and was part of the army during World War I and the Spanish-American War. There's an amazing picture in the forward book of General Frederick Grant on a horse in front of a World War II biplane. That's like mind-blowing for me because he traveled with his father as a child. I think he was 14 during the Battle of Vicksburg and actually got shot in the leg, which is amazing. And so talk about a life in the military. He had more of a life than his father did in the military. But needless to say, Fred was there with his father. Mark Twain comes in and Twain asks about the memoirs. He said, yeah, I'm just about to sign a contract with the Century people. And Twain said, I know a little bit about contracts and about publishing. Would you mind if I look at it just, to make sure there aren't any things in there that you don't want to be in there? Right. And Twain and Fred, and Ulysses and Fred are like, oh, that's so kind of you, they're handing over the contract so that the competition can see it. So Twain looks through this and they were only going to offer Grant 10% royalty. And they were going to take out of that things like money for sweeping the offices and postage and ridiculous things that you and I see in contracts from time to time. Yeah. And here he is, the savior of the Union, 2-term president, known around the world. Everywhere that Grant went, thousands of people came out to see him, even in places like Italy and China and Japan. There were all these hordes that came out to see the person who won the Civil War, and they were going to, give him 10%. And so Twain said, listen, I recommend that you scribble out 10% and put 20% in there and scribble out this whole thing about sweeping the floors and that nonsense. And Ulysses kind of laughed and said, I can't do that. That's not right. And Twain said, those who think that that's not right, they actually get 2 halos in heaven because you're absolutely entitled to these things and they're not treating you well. Well, Fred Grant was concerned, especially after the fall of Grant and Ward, the investment company. Right. And so he said, Dad, we really should look into this. So they ended up, talking about it. And Grant said to Twain, well, I can't go with another author because they were the first ones to come and speak to me. And Twain said, well, wait a minute. If you're going to give it to the first publisher that spoke to you, then you're going to give it to me because I spoke to you about it 2 years ago. And Fred said, Dad, I was in that meeting. I remember. And Grant said, oh, yeah, you're right. And so now Grant is feeling conflicted. And so they brought in a friend who was a publisher of a newspaper in Philadelphia, who then brought in his lawyer. And the lawyer looked at both contracts. And after a thorough investigation with Fred right by his side, checking everything, Fred is a hero. I love Frederick Grant. And finally, the lawyer said, Mark Twain has given you a better deal. And so between that recommendation and their friendship, Grant went ahead and gave the contract to Mark Twain, who treated them extraordinarily well and really went out of his way. And one of the reasons that the book was such a success is that Twain said, we can't just put these books on a shelf. We need to create a sales force. And so they created this sales force by hiring veterans, and they told them, wear your uniform with as many medals as you can find and go out door to door and ask for the veteran in the house. And they made an appeal to support their commander, who helped lead them to victory. And that's one of the reasons that the book sold so well.
That's great. That's outstanding. And, I know it became a great success and Grant did well because I read your book. And in your book also, you talk a lot about the different things that Grant had to put up with. Not only he was betrayed several times, and that to me was amazing. And he still came back from that, coming back from poverty, having lost over $100,000 with that scheme that came up at the very beginning with Ward. That was terrible. And then on top of that, when he was working with President Lincoln, he had an interesting relationship. Lincoln really trusted him a lot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you have to look back at the relationships that Lincoln had with his previous generals to understand why Grant was so special to him and why he grew in his trust of Grant. Just like I'm sure you experienced in the military, there's all kinds of rivalries that happen, and there's competition, and people, they want that promotion, just like A Few Good Men, where, the Jack Nicholson character says, I was promoted ahead of you and faster than you. And if that causes you pain, I don't care. And so that always has been part of the human condition. And Grant had to put up with a lot of that. He actually came close to quitting after he won the Battle of Shiloh, which was a tremendous victory. He was blamed for all of the deaths, and he was basically demoted when Halleck, General Henry Halleck, came in, who was his superior, and took over and basically said, Grant, you're second in command, which means you have no authority.
Wow.
And Grant was almost going to quit at that point, and Sherman came in and convinced him to stay, which was very good because right after that, Halleck was moved to Washington, D.C. by Lincoln, and Grant was then promoted and went after Vicksburg. And so Lincoln had been watching Grant, and a lot of people, a lot of politicians, a lot of generals said, this guy, Grant, he's a drunk. He's an alcoholic. Well, they didn't call it alcoholic back then. They called them drunkards. And he cannot be trusted. And he's been drinking even during the battles. And, you can't trust this guy. Well, the problem was that at Belmont, he won. At Donelson, he not only won, but a whole Confederate army surrendered to him. And then at Shiloh, he won. And so there were some politicians who came to Lincoln, and they were, teetotalers, and that's cool, no problem. But they were basically using their philosophy to say, you need to get rid of Grant because he drinks. And it was reported in a newspaper that Lincoln said, please tell me the name of the whiskey that he drinks, because I want to send a barrel to all the rest of my generals. In other words, if that's what's making him win, then let's let everybody drink. And that was the thing, is that Lincoln recognized that he was, there was something special about Grant. He was a winner. And another person trying to get him to get rid of Grant, Lincoln responded, I can't spare this man. He fights, which a lot of the other generals always complained, we don't have enough resources. McClellan, it's almost, 2020 hindsight is 2020, but the things that McClellan would say about Lincoln were unbelievably disrespectful. He would constantly say the Confederates have twice as many troops as we have. They have way more resources than we have, when in reality, the Union always had way more troops than the Confederates did, and they were better equipped. And so it was a strange type of situation. The same thing with Pope, the same thing with Hooker, who spoke in a very derogatory manner about Lincoln. And so when Grant came along and never complained to Lincoln at all, and took what Lincoln gave him, which, Lincoln and the War Department and Stanton, they were very, very careful to try to give as much support as they could while still supporting the other armies. Lincoln was like, there's something different about this guy. He's very special. And so then when Grant won in Vicksburg, well, on the way to winning in Vicksburg, Lincoln said, you really should go south and hook up with Nathaniel Banks and then come back up north and attack from the south against Vicksburg directly. Well, right. Grant ignored that advice, and he ignored Banks altogether because he knew that in battle that it was all about what he called celerity, what the Nazis later called blitzkrieg.
Right.
The faster that you would move, the more likely that you would win. And so when Grant got his army across, and all these details are in the book, but when he got his army across the Mississippi River over into Mississippi and on dry ground, he knew he had to go after him in a blitzkrieg manner. So he ignored Lincoln. And we all know now that it was the right decision, because Grant won and Vicksburg fell, which allowed the Union to have control of the Mississippi and most of the coast, which cut off supplies coming into the Confederacy. It was strategically, some historians and writers say that Vicksburg was really more important than Gettysburg. Now, the American public doesn't like that, because Gettysburg is very romantic, and Gettysburg was a very important battle, but Vicksburg strategically was extremely important. And after that victory, Lincoln said of Grant, he is my man and I am his for the rest of the war.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I don't know how much time we have for this Facebook Live, but I tell you, I really did want to know at least one more thing.
All right, we'll end with this question.
Okay, so what did you, Victor is a tremendous book. I really enjoyed reading it. It was fantastic for me as a military officer to read about the battles and then read about the character of Ulysses Grant. I learned a lot of things while I was going through the book, but what did you learn as a person who's a historian or somebody that's studying a character of somebody? What did you learn out of the book?
That is a great question. I really appreciate that. I think that for me, it was this person who was misunderstood, and as we just talked about, was had competition that really, Halleck tried to destroy Ulysses S. Grant. He wanted to destroy him. He wanted him out of the army. And there was a period where Grant had been sending back, and this was during the Donelson campaign, he had been sending back all these telegraphs, but there was a Confederate sympathizer in the telegraph office, and he was not forwarding those telegraphs to Halleck. And Halleck went to McClellan, who was at that time the chief of the army. He was the top general, and said, I want Grant out. He's a drunk. He's a sluggard. He's not obeying orders, and I want him gone. And McClellan basically said, go ahead, fire him. So you think how close it came. Right. And fortunately, communications were reestablished, and Grant was able to prove that he had been communicating the whole time. But there were other times where Halleck did stuff that was very he undermined Grant's authority and Grant's capability of fighting his battles. And, it's interesting because it was actually, Grant went to Halleck about Fort Donelson and said, I think that's what we strategically need to do next. Well, because it wasn't Halleck's idea, he would not approve of the attack on those forts there on the Cumberland and the Tennessee River, which were the gateway to the South.
Right.
And Grant was going nuts. He was like, this is the thing to do. Everybody with a military understanding knew, but it was that rivalry that was keeping the war from being properly fought, which that happens in war. And it's very sad when it does. But, so many of the Union generals were just standing around preparing their armies.
Right.
And finally, Lincoln got sick of it. And he issued an executive order, his military order number 1, I believe, where he said, on this date, every Union commander will attack the enemy. And Halleck had no choice now because he had no other plan. And so he said, okay, Grant, go ahead. You can attack these 2 forts. And that released Grant to do what he needed to do. And then the rest is history. And so thank God, and the thing about it is that in answer to your question, Grant had been an alcoholic, and his alcoholism, and there's far too much detail for us to share right now. Maybe we'll have you back and we could talk about this another time.
Okay.
But it drummed him out of the service on the West Coast. And so he went through 7 years of very difficult times where he tried to be a farmer, and he worked very diligently, but there was one of the first great depressions in America during that time. And we all know what happened to the farmers during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the same thing happened to Grant. And so he almost could not get back into the Army, but he was diligent with the small assignment that he was offered, which was to be a mustering officer. And the other officers saw this. And later on, when there was a colonel of a regiment who was a terrible leader, and his troops were just in disarray, and they were burning down chicken coops and things like this, the officers went to the governor, and the governor had been told by McClellan and others, don't hire Grant. He's a drunk. Don't trust him. But these officers had seen Grant in action as a mustering officer, and they went to Governor Yates in Illinois, and they said, our commander is awful. We want him fired, and we want you to hire Ulysses S. Grant as the colonel. And that was the door that opened for Grant, and he moved very quickly up the ladder. And so again and again, we see where Grant was misunderstood. He was held back. He was underestimated. But again and again, because of hard work, faith in God, his wonderful relationship with his wife, accountability to friends, and his applying his education with his strategic mind, he was able to overcome again and again. And he's one of the great leaders in American history. And that caught my attention and made me think we need role models in America and in the world today. And this man is a true role model and a true hero. And so that's why I wrote Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. So Aaron, thank you so much. I appreciate the questions, and thank you, Colonel Zook, for being with us today. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Well, Dr. Von Busick, I thank you so much for the time to actually sit and chat with you. I really thought it was very informative to me. I hope it's informative to the listeners and those that want to find out more about Grant. I was really impressed by your book. I really recommend it to anybody who's a military aficionado, somebody that really wants to delve in and find out about the leadership of the military, somebody who's really interested in understanding the character it takes to build a leader who's going to be a strategic genius, the way Grant was. I also really appreciate the fact that you brought up all the things about the revisionist history that was being written about him, the lost cause folks that were out there trying to prove that his cause was something else other than against slavery. That's really good because I think people are trying to revise history all the time, and it's really good to get it straight. I really appreciate your book. It gave me a new perspective as a military officer on what I was reading about in the battles and about the character behind the battle. The way you intertwined them in the book is just incredible. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about it. I really appreciate that. And as a writer, I can tell you that I was really fascinated by your writing. I had a hard time putting your book down. I have to go to sleep sometimes, but it's an excellent book.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that so much. And thank you also for your very kind and generous endorsement of it. I know that goes a long way for other people with a military background, both in the military or retired, to be able to say, hey, here's a guy who really knows what he's talking about. And so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. I want to give a shout out to Dina and Richard and Ben, who are some of the people in the chat room that are joining us tonight. We are so glad that you have been with us, and thank you for being here. Hopefully, we're running out of time tonight, but hopefully in a future edition of Stories and Myths, my program, my weekly program, you'll be able to join us and ask your questions. And if you have questions, go ahead and send them in, and we can address them next week. So we will be back here next week at our normal time, which is 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so East Coast United States time, for Stories and Myths. And next week, I will be introducing my new co-host, who is a wonderful guy. We'll leave it up for that introduction for next week. But for those of you who are interested, you can order the book, which is now available. It came out this week, Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, at GrantVictorBook.com. Once again, GrantVictorBook.com, or on Amazon or wherever books are sold. If you want more information on my writing and my other books, just go to vonbuseck.com. That's very simple. VONBUSECK.com. VONBUSECK.com. So for Colonel Aaron Zook, I am Craig Von Buseck. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. We'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.